Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Magic, a podcast exploring the intersection of education, fantasy, and literacy. Here at Teaching with Magic, we explore the different ways that teachers in the fiction and in the real world make magic for their students. You'll hear discussions about teachers and teaching methods in fantasy, science fiction, and pop culture. You'll hear interviews with scholars in various fields about important topics in education, and you'll get to be a part of an ongoing conversation about why the imagination matters. Welcome to Teaching with Magic. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Teaching with Magic. Thank you for your love and support as I navigated some pretty murky waters these past few months. Life, unfortunately, got in the way of my completing this episode during its regularly scheduled time, but I am eternally grateful to you for your understanding and your patience. Part of the chaos this year has included a new position at a local independent school as a middle school humanities teacher. One of the first units that I taught for the global history portion of the course was an introduction to geography and cartography. I knew I had to consult with a dear Signum friend of mine who lives and breathes fantasy maps. I wanted to know exactly how I could engage my students and reflect with them throughout the year as our knowledge of maps, map making, and peoples and cultures continue to grow throughout the year. Could fantasy maps be more than just an entry point to understanding cartography, or could we broaden their understanding even further? And what are the tools and resources that we can use to help our students understand our space, time, and how the space and time is represented through map making? Today's guest is Dr. Stentor Danielson of Slippery Rock University. Stentor specializes in cultural geography, environmental ethics and justice, and wildfire management. Their research interests often merge their love of cultural geography and J.R.R. Tolkien, with peer-reviewed articles in the Journal of Tolkien Research and some new publications on the way. And as an added bonus, Stentor and their family have been taking care of some lovely kittens, and so we'll see some special guests appearing every so often throughout the episode. I apologize in advance if you're only listening on the audio, but they're there. I hope you'll enjoy this episode, and please feel free to reach out to myself or to Stentor if you have any questions after this podcast is finished. Well, Stentor, I am so glad to have you here. I've been dying to talk to you for ages because your work on fantasy maps is just absolutely fascinating. So what subjects and age ranges do you teach?
Okay, so I teach at the college level, so college undergrads, little older than your usual target age group, but and so my program that I'm in is called Environmental Geoscience, and what I teach within that is sort of a mix of, I teach some of our introductory physical science courses, but then most of the upper level courses I teach are more about the human side of environmental issues. So I teach things like environmental justice, gender in the environment, economic geography. So kind of the human geography and human environment kinds of topics.
Can I ask, what does that look? I mean, this is probably a very, very big question on some very detailed subjects, but what does that human side look like? Is that, I wonder if that's something that we can talk about bringing to a K-12 classroom.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I love about my area, and so I should say my official degree, my PhD, is in geography. And I think geography does a really good job of bringing together all these different elements of the world. It's a very integrative discipline. And, I find that I am reading and referencing work by people across all kinds of different disciplines. So, there are geographers, there are also anthropologists and ecologists and chemists and sociologists and economists and everything whose ideas and work I can draw on to put it all together and see how things all connect. And that's one of the things that I really like about geography as a subject.
That's wonderful. So I imagine that it's economic. There's an element of economics. There's an element of how
Hmm.
people interact, not just with the land, but with how the land is diagrammed, how it's written,
Hmm.
place names and the cultural implications behind these place names, behind the linguistics of these place names. I imagine that goes
Yeah,
into it as well.
yeah, and just as a slight side note for the people watching this on video, you may see these two adorable kittens hopping
Kittens,
across. This is Olga and Helga, our foster kittens.
unofficial
So just
co-host.
if you see a tail coming across and stuff,
It's a kitten.
and if you're listening to this in audio, I guess you can go check out the video version if you want to see some adorable kittens.
Yes, we'll just see a little tail like the Jaws theme, and just have the
Yeah.
Jaws theme song. Dun 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 dun
Yep,
dun dun dun
there she
dun.
goes.
Much
Um,
cuter, much cuter though.
yes. Yeah, so anyway, if you're thinking about, well, what is geography? One of the kind of classic definitions is that geography is about what is where, why there, and why care. That's kind of the classic phrasing.
Ooh.
And so, we're interested in where things are located on the earth, understanding why they're arranged that way. Why are there mountains here and, plains there and an ocean there? Why is this country rich and that country over there is poor? Why,
Mm,
does this kind of culture prevail in this area and something different is happening somewhere else? Why are people using their environment in one way in one place and a different way someplace else? And then the why care, like this all matters to our
mm,
lives. This is not just something that is cool to know about, like fun facts to share at a party. It also, really dramatically affects how we live and what we need to do to be a better society. Um, so yeah, so I really like that about geography, the way it integrates all these different things. And so then um, cartography is one of our major tools for doing that. If we're trying to
mm,
understand where things are, analyze why they're that way, think about different ways that they could be, um, then a map is your most powerful tool for that. If you can lay things out spatially and understand uh, how they're arranged and related to each other, how different factors overlap with each other. You can put together different maps of different things, right, and
mm,
see how they connect. Is this thing found in the same place as that thing? um so maps are a really powerful tool for that and for communicating things with the rest of the world. And that's one of the things I really like about being in the job that I have now, that's primarily teaching focused.
mhm,
I teach what uh, in academia we would call a 4-4. I have, generally 4 classes per semester that I teach. So it's on the higher end of a teaching load for a university position, but I really like being able to convey all this stuff to students and help them to understand how our world works and how we use maps to understand it, because a map is not just a transparent representation of what's in the world. I always say that maps simplify the world for a purpose, and you have to understand what purpose that map is for in order to understand what choices were made in making that map and how do those choices affect what we can learn from that map. Choices about things, what data to put on the map, what projection to use, what kind of symbology to use, what scale to map something at. All those things make a difference to what we can learn from that map, what story that map is going to tell us about the world. And it's important to understand what maps are doing, how they work. In the same way that it's important to understand how language and writing work, so
mm,
that if you read a text about something, you understand what was the author trying to do, what story are they trying to tell us about the world, what was their intended audience. um, you know because a text is not always straightforward. You can't always just read it and be like, oh, boom, there, I know what's going on. You have to understand this deeper context to to really make the most out of it, to avoid being misled either deliberately or accidentally by the text. And all those same things apply to maps.
That's fantastic because I think one of the main misconceptions that I had growing up was that a map was an accurate, well, I suppose accurate's the wrong word, but it's a very one-to-one correspondence of this is
Mm-hmm.
what I see on the map, that's what's there, this is fact. Whereas what I'm getting from what you've shared with me is that humans who create maps do so with different purposes in mind, and different maps will show different information. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, sometimes the scaling is different based on the message that they want to convey, or um, sometimes it's a topographical map. I'm more interested in the natural resources, or a city map. I'm more interested in the place names. Would you
Mm-hmm.
find that to be an accurate summary
Yeah.
of essentially what you said?
Yeah, kind of one of my hobby horses when talking about maps is to get people away from this idea that you just have this sort of simple dichotomy or one-dimensional scale between accurate maps and inaccurate maps.
Right.
Because I mean, obviously, there could be maps that are completely inaccurate that have nothing to do with reality. But a lot of times, what you're really seeing is what do you want to present accurately on the map, and
Mm,
therefore what sacrifices do you make in order to do that? Because no map can show everything. So,
right.
an example that people might be familiar with is the Mercator projection,
Yes.
right? So it's kind of infamous because it's inaccurate in how it shows the sizes of things, right? So, Greenland is as big as Africa on the Mercator projection. That's not true in the real world, right? So people are like, oh, this is an inaccurate map. Well, it's inaccurate in how it shows the sizes of things, but it's actually extremely accurate in how it shows directions. So
Mm,
if you have a Mercator projection, you measure the angle, of the route from one place to another on a Mercator projection. That is exactly like the compass direction you would follow on the Earth to navigate from there. And that's why that projection was created, was to help navigators, sailing across the ocean. So it's extremely accurate with regard to direction. And in order to be accurate with regard to direction, they had to make it inaccurate with regard to size. And there are other maps that are accurate with regard to size. A
right.
bunch of them, we call them equal area projections, right? But they're highly inaccurate with respect to direction, right? And so you have to decide that for the map that I'm making, what do I need to be accurate about this, right?
Mm,
If I am a sailor trying to cross the ocean, then I really need that directional accuracy. If I am making a map, maybe a map of global deforestation, then I really want the area to be accurate, right? Because
right.
otherwise I get a distorted view of how much deforestation there is if, the deforestation shown in polar areas gets inflated relative to the equatorial areas. So
Mm,
it's really about making choices about how you're going to put things on the map that are appropriate choices for what you're using that map for the story you're trying to tell with that map. And then as a reader of maps, understanding what choices the map maker might have made so
mm.
that you are interpreting what's going on correctly.
Okay. So if I were to put an English teacher spin on this, it's kind of like author's purpose,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps, where an author will have a different purpose for their text. Is it to persuade or to inform or to
Mm-hmm.
entertain? The map also will have a different purpose depending on the audience, depending on who's reading it, and the information that needs to be conveyed in order for the
Mm-hmm.
traveler or for the builder, whomever is reading the map, to be
Mm-hmm.
successful in their task.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
I like that. I like that very much. So, which fantasy, science fiction, pop culture stories do you like to use in your teaching as you're sharing this information? As you're teaching about maps, what are the parallels that you draw in fantasy, and draw that and bridge that gap between the fictional content and the content in your geography and cartography classes?
So one of the main ones that I use in my classes is actually Tolkien. Um, And so I always tell my students that, if they can either thank or blame J.R.R. Tolkien for me being their professor, because this reading Lord of the Rings is what got me into being interested in maps.
Mm,
Because there are some really cool maps in Lord of the Rings, and I just loved looking at them and thinking about what they were telling me about this world and what they weren't telling me about this world. Where are the gaps that you can fill in with your own imagination. Um, and so I have a lesson in my cultural geography class where we use Lord of the Rings, and in particular, we don't have time in that class to read the entire trilogy. We
Aw.
focus, yeah, um, we focus in on the section of the Two Towers involving Fangorn Forest and the Ents attacking Isengard.
Mm.
Um, and we're using that as a case study for how people use ideas about geography to convey messages, right? How is geography represented in forms of media? And so we have that as kind of our fictional, fully fictional example. Middle Earth is a totally made up place, but it's a place that we can understand because it has parallels to real places. Right. So
Mm.
Fangorn Forest doesn't exist, but old creepy forests do exist.
That
Right.
they
And so
do.
why would Tolkien make Fangorn that kind of forest? Well, what's the message he's trying to send? Why would he describe Isengard in the way that he does? Why is he juxtaposing that with Fangorn in that way? What are the kind of the messages that we're going to get from this text by the way that it's represented there? And we also compare the way that it's portrayed in the Peter Jackson movies. Um,
Mm.
so I've watched those movies a bunch of times, but I've watched specifically the section with the Ents so many times because I play it for the class and we talk about, we kind of can look at both the textual version from the books and the visual version from the movies. And I always put this then in conversation with the movie Schindler's List, which
Oh.
is very like famously based on a true story, right? Oscar Schindler was a real guy. He really saved a bunch of people from the Holocaust. Um, but there are a lot of interesting things in how, when Spielberg made that movie, he had to think about how he's representing the places in that movie, portraying them to the audience, because you can't just wind the clock back and go film that during the actual events.
Yeah.
And there were things that he actually did with the way that the landscape is portrayed in the movie that are not accurate, in quotes, to the actual geography of the place, but that help to make the larger points that he's trying to make about the Holocaust and what goes on. So, like, one of the notable examples is that in real life, the camp commander's house was actually in a valley below where the concentration camp was, but in the movie, they portrayed as being kind of up on a hill
Right.
because that conveys this idea of power, right? Being high up, we associate with kind of dominating power, right? That's why Saruman and Sauron both live in towers, right, or up on mountains. And so Spielberg kind of rearranged the geography a little bit there to convey that message, right, and to show us how evil the Nazis were, because now he's looking down over the camp, and there's that scene where he like grabs the gun and shoots people down in the camp, and it makes it a more dramatic vision of that by the way that he uses geography in the film. And so then we can compare, what we're doing with something that is based so heavily on a real true story versus something that's set in a fictional world, but is drawing on things that we know about the real world to make the points and convey the ideas that Tolkien was going for. And so then with that lesson, we go through those and like analyze those examples in detail. And then I always ask them to pick their own example, pick a piece of pop culture that you're familiar with. And they work in like small groups and try to do the same kind of analysis, like how is geography and the landscape being used in your chosen piece of pop culture, and how does it connect to the themes of the work, and what can we learn by looking more closely at the choices being made by the filmmakers or the authors or whatever in their use of geography.
What are some of the examples that your students have come up with?
So some of the ones that they've looked at, I often have people doing Harry Potter. Um,
Okay.
so we just did a big fantasy, example, so I think that's on people's minds. Um, People have had some interesting things to say about Frozen,
Oh,
the Disney movie, which I actually also thought that was a really interesting movie from a kind of geographical point of view, and the way the different kinds of places that they go to and the way they interact with the environment in that movie.
right.
Um, um, they're often a lot that I'm not familiar with myself, and I have to kind of take their word for it because, um, you know, I don't see a ton of movies myself, so they're often things I haven't seen. And plus, I'm realizing now, as I'm getting older, I'm getting more and more out of touch with the pop culture that my students are interested in.
Yeah,
Um,
it happens.
yeah.
Oh man, I'm trying to think of some other like, especially when there's very little parallel between the primary world and the secondary world that they've built.
Hmm.
So then how do you take something that's, I mean, at least with Tolkien or with other authors, there's some quote unquote real world example.
Hmm.
I mean, of course, Tolkien didn't do a one-to-one correspondence with England, but as he
Yeah.
created the maps, he said that these particular areas were, hey, this is, when you were talking about Gondor or I want to say it was Gondor, but there's another part where there's a river dividing the land. It might have been in the Silmarillion. I could be wrong. Somebody's going to correct me, I'm sure. But he's like, yeah, that's Mesopotamia. That's the Tigris and
Hmm.
Euphrates River dividing. Yeah, it was. It must have been the end. It must be the Anduin, right? It's got to
Hmm.
be the Anduin,
I think so.
probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
He had parallels between Gondor and like Mesopotamia and Egypt.
right.
And the Shire obviously has a lot to do with England and yeah. Yeah. And another thing that we talk about is the effect that this has had on real places because, you know, Tolkien famously said that his original inspiration was he wanted to write a mythology for England.
Right.
And so a lot of things, and he moved away from that as like, the explicit agenda over the course of his life, but that Englishness is woven all through it. But if you
Right.
ask somebody today, where in the real world would you go if you wanted to feel like you were in Middle Earth? Most people would say New Zealand
Right.
because that was so prominently featured in the Peter Jackson movies. And so there's a ton of Middle Earth tourism to New Zealand, and it creates this weird tension because New Zealand was colonized by Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this sort of, in the early days of colonization there was a lot of efforts by the colonists to kind of recreate British landscapes in New Zealand and Australia. So they're
Yeah.
like, what is all this weird stuff here on the opposite side of the world? I'm as far away as you can possibly get from my home. So, they brought in lots of non-native species and, had some, if you read early writings about like the wildlife in Australia and New Zealand,
Oh my
it is
God.
really negative. They're like, these are like primitive failed animals, and it's like it's horrible. And there's been this big cultural shift in Australia and New Zealand to embrace the uniqueness of their ecology and geography, and also to try to reconcile with the indigenous populations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then to now have New Zealand's biggest tourist industry being people who are coming there because they're fans of an English book,
Right.
it kind of has this real tension with
It does.
uh, the desire to kind of decolonize and bring the Maori perspective into prominence. Like I mean, in those movies, right? The only Maori actors in
Mm-hmm.
the Peter Jackson movies were playing orcs. They're playing evil creatures, and they're in makeup so that you can't even see them. Um, there's a really interesting tension there that I like to talk about in class.
Absolutely. I remember I actually did go to New Zealand for my honeymoon with my husband. We took a camper van all throughout. And I remember being gobsmacked when I realized that there were no natural predators in New Zealand. There were no natural animal predators. And the only predators that are there were introduced by the English.
Hmm.
So you have cats that are, killing the
Yeah.
wildlife, and years upon years upon years of evolution and evolutionary species who have adapted and said we don't need to protect ourselves because we don't
Hmm.
have any natural predators, are suddenly decimated because they're just not equipped to defend
Hmm.
themselves against things like cats, rats, stoats, these
Yeah.
animals that they
Yeah.
would put in their ships to take care of the pests that would come onto the ships. It absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I'm obviously a cat lover,
Right.
but cats have really just done a number on the native fauna in places like Australia and New Zealand where they were introduced. Um,
I mean, their national bird is this adorable kiwi,
mhm.
but can't it's a flightless bird that cannot defend. It's
Yeah.
not like an ostrich
Yeah.
that can give you a good kick. It's this little
Yeah.
tubby little
Yeah.
bird that just waddles around all day. Well, no, not all day,
Yeah.
all night. It's nocturnal. What am I talking about?
Yeah, yeah, and cats don't care. Like these two kittens are running around just killing everything they can find in here. And luckily they've got, you know, toy mice, not like endangered species in this
Yes.
room.
Thank goodness for the
Because
toy mice. This is mine. Yes. This
yeah,
moves. Shadow. Yes. This is mine. This
yeah.
is mine. All this is mine. There's so much that can be talked about, and there's so much that goes into what's represented in a map. And then of course, you talk about the cultural impacts, the racism, you talk about even just how maps differ from not only from for purposes but also from time to time. Like if you look at a
Hmm.
map of a place in the BCE era and a map of today, and you're comparing the landscape between the two, you're probably going to have a very different you're going to have different interpretations, and you're going to see certain places have either eroded away or specific, like I imagine specific mountains or landscapes have either eroded or changed due to climate,
Hmm.
and due to even just the natural process of the earth, with or without the help of climate, the impact of climate change.
Yeah. So there was actually a really interesting map that I came across recently. So I live in Pittsburgh,
Mm.
and um, so if you look at like a map of Pittsburgh today, there are very few streams within the city. And in fact, if you map it
Ah,
out, like you can actually see the change from you get a lot more streams visible outside the city limits. And that's because a lot of these streams have been covered over, filled in, put into underground pipes,
mm,
you know, in order to build more stuff in the interest of flood control. And so there's this really interesting map that somebody has made by going through all of these very old maps of Pittsburgh and finding places where there were streams, or streams were marked on old maps that are not there anymore. And they've like remapped where all these streams are.
that's
And it's really
incredible.
interesting. You can see, and then you superimpose it with GIS on the modern street map, and you can see where all of these, ghost streams are. They've all disappeared through uh, development. And then, a thing that's happening in a lot of cities is efforts to then uncover these streams because we're realizing that it's actually not good. It might be a short-term solution to flooding, but it's actually causing more problems than it helps in many cases. And so there's efforts to uncover these, restore the natural streams. Um, and it's of course a big difficult process to do that. There's a lot of engineering involved and a lot of working with the communities around there. Um, but yeah, just seeing how the changes that happen and the way they're reflected in the maps, and the way that the maps, in this case, the maps are preserving information about stuff that has disappeared, and that people may
Mm.
be living in a house and have no clue that they're living on top of what used to be a stream that was
Right.
part of the ecology of the area. That and probably, if you go back 500 years, the stream probably even had a name, right?
Yeah.
that, and it had a place in the life of the indigenous people that lived there, and now it's just gone.
Oh,
Um,
that's so sad to think about. A place that would have
yeah.
had cultural significance
Hmm.
to a people is just housed over. Oh, that's really sad.
Yeah. And I mean that
But
it kind of ties back to the Tolkien thing too, because that's, the names of things was something he was really interested in.
yes.
And the maps really reflect that. And you just think about how the sort of the basic map that you see at the start of Lord of the Rings often has things in two languages, right? I'll give the English, that's
Yeah.
kind of the translated Westron, but then I'll also give like the Sindarin name, right? It's like
Right.
Blue Mountains, Ered Luin. And that alone, just that naming tells you something about the history of the place, the relationship of the different cultures there. And so place names can be a really fascinating thing to dig into. Like, why is this place called this? Has it been called other things historically? What does it mean that we've given it this name as compared to some other name that it could have had?
I was actually having a conversation with James Tauber once about place names because I was about to teach The Hobbit and I was looking at
Hmm.
some of the names on those maps. And
Hmm.
we talked about how a lot of the place names were often a physical descriptor in the
Hmm.
indigenous language.
Hmm.
So was it an actual slippery rock and then translated to
Hmm.
a the word for a slippery rock in that language? And like you said, we
Hmm.
see the same thing in Ered Luin. That's the Sindarin for Blue Mountains. It's a
Hmm.
physical descriptor of that ecological maybe the mountains shine blue because of this a certain quartz that's shining in the rock, or it looks a
Hmm.
certain way when the sun rises at a certain time. Like there are
Yeah.
stories and cultures. I mean look at the entirety of the mountains of Moria.
Hmm.
If you look at Carathras, you look at those mountains, and you look at Holland, you look at that entire area. Gimli has these legends and songs attached to these rocks, and you
Hmm.
have a conversation between, of course, the Elvish names and the Dwarvish names. So it's so much fun to look at. I love I love my dwarves.
Yeah. I also like the example of the Carrack, where the eagles drop
Yes,
them off in The Hobbit,
yes, the
and how they
Carrick.
they talk in the book about that it's called the Carrack because that's what it is.
Yeah,
Like,
it's a
that's just a
Carrick.
name for that thing, and that thing is the Carrack.
That's exactly
You
it.
know, it's a fun little bit of sort of geographical thinking in The Hobbit there.
Yeah, I love that. It's the Carrick. That's all it is.
Hmm.
It's just the Carrick. What are some of your other
Yeah.
favorite fantasy maps? In addition, of course, there's Tolkien, but are there other more modern
Right.
fantasy maps that you enjoy?
Oh yeah, so I mean, I could go on and
Of
on
course.
and on about all the fantasy maps I like. I'll try to limit it, so because I'm actually working on a book chapter right now about fantasy maps, like as a general phenomenon. And
Yes.
there's four maps that I chose as kind of interesting exemplars, so I can talk a bit about those. So the first one is the map of Earthsea from Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, which I think is such a fantastic series. Like, I love that series so much, especially when, like, the growth that it shows in her as a writer when you
Mm-hmm.
compare, because some writers will go back and try to like retcon things and be embarrassed about bad stuff that they don't like anymore. But she like leaned into it and was like, okay, well, what does it mean that, I wrote this about Earthsea, and spent like her whole life trying to figure out what was going on with this thing she wrote early in her career,
Yeah.
when her ideas about things weren't fully formed. But with the map, that was one of the things that really drew me into that book initially when I was younger, and I was like, okay, I've read Lord of the Rings like six times now. I need to read something else. And the map, helped draw me into that series. And it's a map that's really interesting because it is full of stuff that's not in the books.
Right.
And I actually went through the last time I reread the Earthsea series. I just went through, I made a list of all of the places that are on the map, and I made a note of when is this place first actually referenced in the text. Just on the basic, like the main map of Earthsea, right? Because then she also has like a specific map of Gaunt from Tehanu and stuff, right? But just in that
Hmm.
main map of Earthsea, those published in Wizard of Earthsea, that when that was originally published, that was intended to be a standalone. Like she
Yes.
didn't write that with the intention of it becoming a trilogy. Um, and it's, I forget the exact statistic. I'd have to look it up again, but it's something like 60%, I think, of the places on the map actually get referenced in the text of A Wizard of Earthsea. So there's a
Hmm.
ton of stuff on that map that's not in the text. And in an interview, she said, "Well, I started out, I was going to write this novel about this world." She had the concept that it's this world of islands and stuff, and she started out by drawing this map and just labeling it and drawing cool islands. And then as she wrote the book, she was kind of exploring this map. So she had mapped it out first, and then as she wrote, she was exploring all of these things and figuring out, okay, well, what is on this island? This island looks cool over here. What can I envision that would be on here? And so I think that's a really cool approach uh, to mapping and thinking about a world, that she had the world and then she explored it through writing stories uh, about it. And I think there's some places that I think still don't get a mention anywhere in the entire series. It's 6 books. That there's still a few islands that are on the map that she didn't talk about. So they remain places to be explored. Um, and I think that's one of the really fun things to do as a reader, right? Is to look at the maps, think about the places that are either not mentioned in the text or only mentioned very briefly, right? Because if you think, to go back to Tolkien, right? If you put a map of where the story actually follows people on top of the map of Middle Earth, there's lots of stuff. They never go there, right? They might
Right.
mention it once. And so there's lots of places to exercise your imagination. Then a sort of a really interesting contrasting example to that is the maps from the Thomas Covenant series by Stephen R. Donaldson. Because the underlying premise of that series is that Thomas Covenant is a man from our world that gets magically transported to this fantasy world, and he refuses to believe that it's real because he fears that he's gonna destroy himself by if he lets himself believe that he's actually in this fantasy world. And so the whole the original trilogy, that's like the underlying tension of, is this place really real or not? And I won't spoiler, the resolution, which I think I'll say it's not a simple yes or no at the end. And I
Sure.
really love the resolution that this story comes to. But one of the things the map does is, so the map looks like your standard fantasy map, like Tolkien style. It's got the little pictures of mountains and stuff, but it's kind of the opposite of the Earthsea map, because the the story basically systematically visits every place on that map. There's nowhere on that's on the map that's not in the story. And so
Mm.
that emphasizes this idea that maybe this could all just be in his head, because there aren't these unexplored areas and things that the story didn't go to, because the story is only a partial representation, right? Because like in Earthsea, there's presumably a million stories of people living in Earthsea that aren't written down in the books.
Right.
Whereas with the Thomas Covenant series, maybe the only thing that exists about the land is what Thomas Covenant is experiencing in his like hallucinations about being in this fantasy world. And so the map actually fits and reinforces that idea of the books. And I've actually heard some people say, "Oh man, I wish there was like a Silmarillion of the Thomas Covenant series with all the like extra backstory and stuff." And I'm like, that would actually kind of ruin the point of the book, which is like, you don't know, is this all just in his head or not? Um, as compared to something like Tolkien, where no, this is this fully fledged world that we're only getting this little glimpse of. So I find it really interesting the way he used the map to help tell the story, to reinforce the concepts in the story. Um, then another really interesting one that I'm going to talk about in my chapter is from the Acacia trilogy by David Anthony Durham. And so that one, that's a series that I wish more people knew about. So I think it's a really cool series. And so the map that you get in the first book is labeled The Known World. And so it's a map of
Ooh.
this sort of one continent, but you can see it kind of connects to something going off the map. And a lot of the story is about how the dynasty that rules this known world has kind of cut it off from everybody else that might exist in the world. And so then as you go through the second and third books of the series, the map actually expands. So you get more stuff. And it's not just like, there's plenty of fantasy series that are like, okay, sequel, we're going to go somewhere else. So here's a map of, some more land. But it's actually reflecting the changing perspective that the people in the books have about the world and about their world, because the main characters in the books are the heirs to this dynasty that has, controlled the known world for so long. And they're all wrestling with, what do we do as the heirs to this dynasty, knowing what our forebears have done and the way that they have controlled our people's relationship to the wider world. What do we do now? Now that we're inheriting this position, and it's reflected in the way the maps are illustrating things in the books. And even the final map, the map in the third book, that's the most expansive, still clearly does not cover everything that exists on this planet that they're on, right? And then the last example that I'm talking about in my article is from N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season, which is one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. And I find it really interesting because she was a big anti-map person. Like
Aha.
she's written like on her blog and stuff about why she didn't include, because it's her third like fantasy series,
Yeah.
right? And the first two that she wrote did not include maps. And that was a very deliberate choice on her part, right? It wasn't just like the publisher didn't want to pay for it or something. Like she very deliberately did not include maps as
Hmm.
part of her vision of how the story should be experienced and her attempt to position herself relative to the sort of Tolkien tradition that dominates fantasy, right? So much of
Right.
fantasy is responses to Tolkien, and the maps are such a Tolkienian thing, right? And so by not having maps, it was part of her effort to position herself relative to that uh, Tolkien tradition. So she was very, very vocally anti-map. And then she posted something just before the fifth season came out about how she kind of like reluctantly conceded that this needed a map because of the geographical scope of what's going on and that people wouldn't understand it without a map. Um, but if you actually look at the map and use it to follow the story, you'll find the map is actually, it's not just, okay, here's a map of the stillness, the world that it's set in. The map is intimately connected to the story, and there's sort of a giant spoiler that I don't want to give for people
Yeah.
that haven't read that book. But the book, there's three storylines, right? These three different viewpoint characters that you're following, and so what I'll say is, if you're reading this book, pay attention to what's on the map for each of the three storylines. And I think it's actually really interesting because it is not a comprehensive map. It does not include everything that is mentioned in the text. So sort of the opposite of Le Guin. Her map has tons of stuff that's never mentioned in the text. The map in the fifth season leaves off a bunch of things that are mentioned in the text, but it's not just random. It's not just because it's like a bad map. Um, it's like
It's deliberate.
she is very clearly making very deliberate choices about what's on the map and what's not on the map. And my article will be full of spoilers, but since people listening to your podcast might not have read that
Yeah.
book, I won't go into it, but I would encourage it. But I think that's a good thing to do with any map. If you're reading a book that has a map in it, whether it's a fantasy world where it's a map because it's a place that doesn't exist, or there are plenty of books set in the real world that include maps to
Right.
highlight the places that are important in that story. Pay attention to what's on the map, what's not on the map, what choices were being made about what things to portray, what things didn't need to be portrayed.
Hmm.
And
So
I
then,
think you'll find some interesting things.
for sure. So that's actually a great segue because my next question is what are your goals for students by the end of your class? What when you're teaching cartography and ecology through this fantasy perspective,
Mhm.
what do you hope that your students are going to come away with by the end of the course? What are your goals and what are you essentially assessing for by
Mhm.
the time the class is over?
Yeah, so I'm trying to make my students into critical map readers.
Right.
So in the same way that in, an English class, you're trying to encourage students to be critical readers of, the text of a novel or whatever. And, it's in some ways very similar to a non-map related exercise that I do in my Science 102 class. So this is like science for non-science majors, a gen ed class. And I usually focus a lot on climate change in
Mm,
that class, because, I think that's something pretty important for everybody to know about. As just a citizen of the world. And one of the things we talk a lot about is, where do you find good scientific information about climate change and how do you evaluate things that you might hear in the media, in memes on social media and all this? How do you become a critical reader of these things? How do you evaluate what you should actually take away from this? How do you read the scientific literature in order to see if it stacks up to what's in this meme that you're seeing? And in the same way, I want students to be critical readers of maps. I want them to not just see the map and be like, okay, this is just like the unfiltered truth of the world because it's on a map. I want them to think about who made this map? Why did they make this map? What choices did they make in making this map? Is this map useful for what I'm using it for?
mhm.
What can I see in this map that is not obvious? Um, how does this map help me then relate to the world that I'm living in? And I think that's true even for maps of fictional places,
Right.
because, yeah, none of us are ever going to go to Isengard or Fangorn Forest, so we don't need to worry about whether, like, the mileage between them is accurate on the map in Lord of the Rings. But from paying attention to these maps, we can learn to be more critical in how we think about the way people show our real world and use descriptions of the landscapes and environments to make points about things. Um, and so I think encouraging that kind of those critical thinking skills is really the most important thing. It's more important than any like factual pieces of information that I might convey.
Mm. So then, what skills do you think that students need to have by the time they start your classes in, or they start a college education with maps and map making? And then, what can they develop through fantasy and fantasy maps? So, if I'm a K to 12 educator and I'm teaching
Mhm.
social studies, what are the kinds of skills that you would hope that I've fostered in my students by the time they come to you in the college and professional setting?
Mhm. Um, so it would be great to have students coming in with some basic map reading skills,
Yeah.
right? For students to be able to understand concepts like, for example, scale, right? To be able to look at a map and identify what's the scale of this map, right? What is it? How big is it? The area it's showing, how much detail is it going into, and how might it be different if you chose a different scale,
Mm,
right? Because I think that's always the sort of the key thing is this map could be different, right?
yeah.
um, and to be able to read some basic types of symbology on maps, right? So to be able to look at a map and see the legend and be able to, based on that, just get basic things about like, okay, here's a map of like, average income across a certain city. Be able to just say, okay, I can see, where in the city are the rich people and the poor people, and be able to read it like that. Um, so there's some of the basic types of symbology that are out there on maps that I think would be, great for students to come in with that already kind of in their pocket. So then we
Mm,
can dive deeper into some of the more complicated choices, right? Because like I don't expect a K-12 teacher to necessarily teach students about the modifiable area unit problem But if you don't understand how to read a basic map where like each county is colored in based on the data you have about it, I'm not going to be able to explain the modifiable area unit problem yet. Um,
Right.
so, having some of those baseline skills of being able to understand, how to read information off a map, how to distinguish different types of maps, right? Knowing when you want to look at a road map, when you want to look at a map of census data, when you want to look at a land cover map, these kinds of different uses that you might make of maps, um, and how to find things on maps. So if I'm like, look at the map and find such and such a place, sometimes students actually struggle to do that, right? Struggle
Mm,
to identify the places and locate them on a map, and that's sort of a basic thing that I'd like to be able to have that as a baseline and build off of that and be able to say, okay, let's just find X on the map and now let's talk about it, rather than having to be like, okay, here's how you find X on the map. Um,
right. And I imagine it's a lot
and
harder nowadays because, we have, Google Maps and Apple Maps. You can just type in the
mhm,
location and boom, it finds it for you. But so
right,
are we losing that skill of finding something on a
yeah.
map?
Yeah, and actually there's been research on that. And yeah, people are losing some of those skills of being able to navigate with a map because of GPS will just tell you where to go.
Mm,
Um, and just being able to translate like, okay, it's to the left on the map, but since I'm going north, I actually have to turn right when I get to that corner. Right? Those are the kind of things that often people can have some trouble with if they're not familiar with using a map.
mm,
And most of the time that's not a big deal because you've got your GPS and it will tell you where to go. But it's also a potentially a useful skill that that you're maybe losing out on.
yeah.
Um,
And especially when you're analyzing important historical data or ecological
mhm,
data that you need to be able to analyze from different perspectives.
mhm.
GPS isn't going to tell you that.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there any other skills that you hope that students are ready with by the time they come to the college level?
Um, I think the other thing that is important is also because we're often working with maps in combination with other sources of information,
Right.
right? Maps are often, they're connected to text, they're connected to audio material, they're connected to other kinds of visual material, photographs and drawings and stuff. And so I think, you know, the basic skills at being able to understand it and work with those other kinds of materials and to connect them to maps is important. So there's actually I was doing some research for another paper that's in progress about the Hunger Games series, which is a really interesting one from a geographical point of view because there's no official map of Panem, but we know that it's like a future version of North America, right? And we get some hints about where the districts are located based on things like their main economic products and stuff. And so, as I was researching this, I came across a lot of like lesson plans that teachers had come up with for K-12 about using the Hunger Games, where you have your students create their own map of Panem. And it's
Hmm.
actually kind of, in a way, good that there isn't an official map. So there isn't a right or wrong answer, and people make different choices about where to locate certain things. Even something like District 12, they tell us it's Appalachia, but is it all of Appalachia? Is it part of it? Is it like, West Virginia? Because they seem to only have that one town there, right? So there's a lot of choices that you can make. And so really what's going on is not can you get the right answer and place each district in its correct location, but what's your thought process? How do you take, the information she gives us, the 2 or 3 sentences that we get about District 3, how do you translate that into putting it on the map? What other resources do you use? You find out, okay, this is the district that produces timber. Okay, how can you find information about timber production to try to estimate where that district might logically be located, or that they visited them in certain order on their like victory tour on the train. So what does that tell you about where they might be located relative to each other? That would be a sensible order to go to in on the train. And all of that kind of thinking about how is the world put together and connecting it to the information we have on the text, and then being able to produce a map showing your conclusions. And then, I think it would be really interesting to do that in a classroom where then, you might have like different groups working on that, and then they can compare, right? And this
Yes.
group would be like, well, I put this district in this state, and this other group is like, well, I put it in this state. And just then the conversation about, well, why did you make those choices? What were the things between information from the text of the book, official statements by the author, and other information that you're bringing in? Well, I found this information about where this thing is uh, produced, and that influenced my choice of how to map this. I think is a really
That's brilliant.
yeah.
Because it is, maps are very multidimensional, and they are often, especially in testing, unfortunately, food testing,
Hmm.
put with they're a text that's put with a text. They're their own source material, but they're also often
Hmm.
put with a reading about it or a letter or something else that helps to
Hmm.
pair the two together. I've rarely seen a test where a map is in isolation. But then again,
Hmm.
I also don't teach social studies or history, so
Right.
that could be different as well.
Yeah, but I mean, in like a social studies or history course, right? There's all kinds of opportunities to connect maps and texts, right?
Yes.
Like you get. And I'm just like spitballing here, right? Coming up with
Yeah.
ideas, right? You could look at, say, a bunch of letters from somebody that was in the Civil War, right? Where they talk
Ooh.
about all of the places they went and the battles they were in and what it was like to traverse this area, right? And try to connect that to maps, both old maps, right? You get maps from that time period
Mm-hmm.
and modern maps, right? And think about, well, what would it be like to travel that route today and how different would it be, right? Because we got all kinds of stuff now that's going to make that way different than it would have been to travel there, in the 1860s, right? So something like that where you're connecting these different things and thinking about people's experiences in that place. And I think that's that one of the reasons I really like maps is that if you know how to read maps, then looking at a map can help you understand what it's like to be in that place. Right? Like that's what I love to do with Tolkien's map. There are lots of places that the story never went. Tolkien never gave you a description of what it was like to be in, the Iron Hills,
Mm-hmm.
but you could look at it on the map. You could look at the way that he's drawn the little hills there and where it's located relative to other things, and you can try to imagine what it might be like to be there. And you could get a map of a place in the real world or a historical map and use that. I've had a lot of fun just looking at historical maps of Pittsburgh and thinking about, okay, I've been to this place today in the 2020s, and I know what it's like to be there today. What must it have been like to be there in, 1920 when, this major highway wasn't there yet, and but there was a streetcar line,
Mm-hmm.
and, this area was actually an island back in the day before they filled in the channel and all these kinds of things. And I think getting students to be able to do that is a really important thing. And I think it can really enhance their ability to understand the world.
Wow. You've done a great job of essentially taking the next three questions that I had on my list and just putting them all together. I love it.
Uh-huh.
So then I will simply ask
So that
them.
listeners
Sure.
know, you did share those questions ahead of time.
I
So,
did.
I
I
was
did.
a little bit prepared
A little bit.
for
Yes.
that.
But no, it's wonderful because the only thing that I would ask on top of that that perhaps hasn't been touched is, sometimes there's a question in, K to 12 of motivation. So how then sometimes teachers are struggling to get kids interested in the kinds of topics that you're talking about. Like, oh, why would I need to do
Hmm.
this? Because I can type it into a GPS. So then
Hmm.
do you have suggestions? I would hope that, presenting a fantasy map is motivating enough, but then again, teenagers, kids, they're going to be who they're going to be.
Hmm.
So do you have other suggestions for ways to get kids motivated and interested in maps and map reading?
I think to me the key is showing them why it's relevant.
Yes.
Because um, on a non-fantasy map example, one of the things that I really work to teach some of my students is how to read a topographic map,
Yes.
because I think topographic maps are really important, really useful, but they are not intuitive.
Mm.
You can't just look at a topographic map if you haven't worked with them before and just kind of see the landscape. Like I can do that because I've been looking at topographic maps in detail for decades and decades. But it's a struggle often for students to be able to take all these like lines on the map and see, okay, where's the hills, where's the valleys, what's steep, what's not. Um, and so I try to, not just be like, okay, what's the elevation of this place? Which side of this hill is steeper than the other? Kind of basic comprehension questions, but also show them how that matters to be, for example, to talk about flooding. Right? Elevation is what determines whether you flood or not. So,
Mm.
I connect that into trying to understand, okay, which of these houses would flood if you got, a flood in this area and which wouldn't, or if there was a chemical spill, right? Who is downstream and who's upstream of that chemical spill? And that was something that was a big concern here in Pittsburgh a little over a year ago. We had the big chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio.
Oh, wow.
And so we were in the position that we are downwind but upstream from East Palestine,
Okay.
because it's in Ohio, it's just to the west of us. And so that's downstream. So the water from Pittsburgh flows down towards East Palestine. So, the pollution of the water was not going to affect us. It wasn't going to come upstream uh, from there to us, but we're downwind because the prevailing winds blow from the west. So air pollution was a potential bigger concern. Right? And so, those are things that's the kind of question that's like very relevant. Like if you hear there's a chemical spill, if you could look at a map and determine whether you're upstream or downstream from that chemical spill, then that tells you whether you need to panic or not about your water supply.
For
Um,
sure.
and so I think, tying it into things that make it relevant, to make them understand why would you need to know this, right? Why would you need to look at this on a map and determine
Hmm.
this? I think is what is the best way to get motivation. And I think connecting it to literature, assuming that they are interested in the particular literature,
Right.
um, right? Like making a map of Moby Dick might not be quite as exciting for a lot of students as making a map of the Hunger Games. And I say that as someone who really liked Moby Dick when I
Yeah.
finally read it.
But it's
Um,
also, that's a lot of
but
water.
yeah, and it's maybe not the thing that students when they first encounter it are
Right.
most excited about, right? But if you can connect it to a story that they're interested in, that they care about,
Hmm.
um, then it can get them engaged with understanding the map. Because, if they have to be able to understand the map to answer this interesting question, if they're now interested, oh yeah, I really wonder where District 5 is, and I care about it because I've met some characters from there, then that can motivate them to be like, okay, well, I should look up where that kind of stuff is produced and what might, you know, reasonably be the location of that uh, in America. And, I saw a lot of responses. I'm going back to that Hunger Games example because I saw a lot of responses then when people would sometimes post their maps of this
Hmm.
online and people would respond and be like, oh, wow, I live in District 6, based on the map that this person had come up with. And so then that also makes it relevant to their lives, right? It
Right.
connects them to, the places that they live in and helps them understand what's going on in their own life better.
Right.
So yeah, I think just building those connections of relevance so that they understand why we're asking them to learn this.
I had a sudden brainwave while you were talking. I did a virtual homeschooling pod position for a while, and I was teaching this pod of like 4 kids. I was teaching them science. I was teaching them like K-2 science at one point, and I had them make salt dough maps of the 7 continents.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking that because these kids were very much like they needed to be kept busy, they
Hmm.
needed to do physical, multi-sensory kind of
Hmm.
activities. So they built these salto maps and painted them topographically with topographical colors to represent I think it was the land, the height, the elevation, and
Hmm.
then kitten.
Yep.
Kitten just went wee.
Yep.
Sorry, listeners. So we were talking about elevation, we were talking about soil erosion, and we were talking about how soil erosion can be affected either by air, by wind, or by water. And I'm wondering if, talking about the upwind downwind connection that you were talking about in Ohio with the chemical spill, like what if, coming up with a situation or posing the question of what if there's a chemical spill in this area, you got to represent
Hmm.
it on a map, then you have to test it
Hmm.
out on a model. I wonder,
Hmm.
just making it multi-sensory and building it from there could be really effective as well. But you can't do it without the map because you need to be able to look at the direction. You need to be able to look at
Yeah.
the stream and the wind and everything that goes into that directionality with it.
Yeah. And it's sorry, this kitten wants to push all the buttons on my computer.
Oh no. So if we have a technical glitch, blame the
Yeah,
kitten, blame Olga.
blame
That's Olga,
Helga.
right?
That's Helga.
That's Helga. Blame Helga.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I think you're making a really good point there about how multisensory maps can be, right? Because, you know, you can draw a map with pen and paper, which even that, right, is very
Yeah.
like, tactile. And when I make maps myself, I like to do them pen and paper because it's so tactile. But, you can build maps out of other materials that engage other senses and also the data collection
Yeah.
aspect of it, right? Because like if you wanted to do that, you were having to build maps of like the entire world, which they can't just go out and explore the whole world. But
Right.
I think a really good exercise could be making maps of your very local area that you're in, where you can actually go out and experience that area. Figure out what do you want to put on the map? What can you find in your world? Because you can make a map of just about anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, we have all of our standard kinds of maps that are easy to find, right? Maps of
Right.
elevation, maps of various demographic things that the census collects, maps of roads. But you could make a map of anything, right? You could go out in the fall and be like, I'm going to make a map of where the different colors of trees are, right?
Yes.
Where do you see trees that have red leaves? Where are they yellow leaves and those kind of things? You could map that out for your neighborhood, right? And then you could see, could you draw any conclusions about that? You could do some research and be like, okay, well, which species of trees tend to turn which colors? And, why might there be mostly maples on this street?
Mm-hmm.
Is it called Maple Street?
Yeah.
Um, you could go and map where you find litter in your neighborhood, right? Make a map, and then you're thinking about a problem. You're hopefully also cleaning up some of that litter as you go, but you're making a
Hopefully.
map where you found it. You could make a map of um, like temperature, right? If you're in an area that's got some hills, you can actually feel the difference in temperature if you go, up the hill and down the hill, or if you go close to a body of water where it's humid versus not, or if you go into a big parking lot where the heat is sizzling off the black, right? And you're engaging your sense of touch. You can feel that the environment is different in those different places. There's actually a really funny map. Um, so there's a series that I'm working on a book about Pittsburgh for this series from Belt Publishing, which is focused on Rust Belt stuff. And it's whatever city in 50 maps.
Mm.
And so I first found this series through finding their Buffalo edition. So Buffalo in 50 maps. And I got to talk to Vicki Johnson Dahl, the author. And one of my favorite maps that she did was a map of the Cheerios smell in downtown Buffalo, because there's a Cheerios factory in Buffalo and you can smell the cereal. And so she and a few other people went out and walked the streets of Buffalo and just mapped like where can you actually smell it from, and where do you stop being able to smell the Cheerios because you're like too far away, and the like the wind patterns and how it blows down the streets. Um, and so she has this map of like the Cheerios smell in Buffalo. And I was thinking like that would be a really cool kind of exercise to do with
Yeah.
students if you're in a place that has a distinctive smell, right? If you've got some sort of industry or something in your town that you can smell, or even just like, you can often smell restaurants as you walk by,
Mm-hmm.
right? If they've got the pizza oven fired up, you can often smell that outside. And so you can map out the smells in your neighborhood and then think about, why can you smell these things here and there? Why is it that walking down this street, you can smell the pizza shop coming a block away, but once you're past it, you don't really smell it anymore, or vice versa.
Right.
So there's a lot of interesting ways that you can use sort of all your senses to gather information. Then you can represent that information on a map and use that process to think about why are things like that? Why does this part of town smell different than that part of town? Why do we see this color leaves in this part of town and not that one? Why do we find this kind of litter here, right? Because the litter thing too, that
Yeah.
gets into questions of like water flow, right? Because you'll
Mm-hmm.
find a big stash of trash. Why is there all this trash here? Well, it's probably not because people are throwing it all there. It's because they're throwing it out all along the street and it's washing down because we're in the bottom of the street and it's all washed
Mm.
down here because we had rain the other day. Uh, you can get students thinking about all kinds of different things about how their world works and sort of hang that on the project of making a map of something about it.
That's amazing. I'm suddenly thinking of that How I Met Your Mother episode where uh, Marshall and Lily buy an apartment in the swanky section of New York called Doissa Tripla. And it turns out that Doissa Tripla stands for downwind of the sewage treatment plant. So it's not
That's
actually a
great.
swanky borough or
Uh-huh.
neighborhood in like Tribeca, which stands
Uh-huh.
for like Triborough. I can't remember exactly what Tribeca stands
Right.
for. It's actually
Right.
named, they took that concept of taking the place name and shortening it. And then the locals were like, yeah, we're downwind of a sewage treatment plant, so you're going to smell it 5 out of the 7 days of the week. And so the real estate people said, all right, we're going to call it Doissa Tripla to make it sound fancy and to make
Hmm.
people actually buy property
Oh,
in this area.
so I haven't watched that show, but that episode, like geographers could have a field day with that,
I can't
right?
even.
Because it pulls in things about like the economics of real estate and the way people want to jump on, oh, here's a house that looks really cheap for the area that it's in, or an apartment that's really cheap for the area it's in. This is a good deal, but then maybe there's something else going on, some other aspect to the geography, right? Because it looks like it's in a really good area, but there's this other thing going on with the sewer plant that makes it undesirable, and that's reflected in the price. And then the marketing thing,
Yes.
I lived in a neighborhood that is officially called East Allegheny, but a lot of the like real estate people and boosters and stuff have tried to unofficially rename it as Deutschtown because that like sounds cooler, right? And to like invoke, because it's an area that had a lot of German settlements back in
Right,
the day.
exactly.
And so the way that we use place names to try to market places and shape how people think about places is really fascinating.
Yeah.
So yeah, so now I kind of want to just, I don't know if I want to commit to that entire show, but I kind of want to watch just
You,
that
you
episode.
can get away with just watching the episode and you'll be okay
Mhm.
if you don't want to go through the
Okay.
entirety of How I Met Your Mother. But that I
Yeah.
think would be really fascinating, especially when you consider like how New York City works. You have, not only do
Hmm.
you have this New York City itself, you have the five boroughs.
Hmm.
Then you have the geography within these five boroughs. Different neighborhoods in New York
Hmm.
City represent different places, ideas, and
Hmm.
cultures. A lot of
Yeah.
different sections in New York City are populated by specific groups of people. So you'll have place names that reflect that, or you'll have street
Hmm.
names that reflect, the Harlem Renaissance. You'll have street
Hmm.
names that reflect, the streets are often renamed or have an additional name under the number, um, to go with the cultural impact of that area. So,
Hmm.
oh boy, yes,
Oh yeah, you
Postage Street
can.
Club.
Oh yeah, trying to understand why different like local areas are the way they are, how they got their like architectural character, what kind of people live there, what kind of amenities are available.
Mm-hmm.
There can be really interesting and tell you a lot about the development of the place and the way geography works and how that interacts with different aspects of culture and the physical environment. And yeah, yeah, there's so much, and that provides a good way to connect it to getting students interested because you know you can do that with the places that they are living in.
Right.
So if I was designing a lesson, I could connect it to the neighborhoods here in Pittsburgh, but then somebody teaching somewhere else would come up with a similar type of lesson, but connected to the places their students are living in. And so then they, feel motivated to learn things because, now when they walk down the street, they see a street sign and they're like, oh, I know why this street is called that. I
Mm-hmm.
understand the history behind it, or I know now why this intersection is at a weird angle.
Yeah.
That there's a reason for that having to do with the topography of it or the history of it or whatever the reason is that you've figured out or now I know why this street has all of the um, stores that clearly serve a particular subculture,
Mm-hmm.
those kind of
Exactly.
things.
I love the idea of playing with different data points. One map could show a million different
Hmm.
pieces of data. So it's not just this is a map, this is truth, this is what I see.
Hmm.
It's also why is this particular data point being represented in this map?
Hmm.
I love that.
Yeah, because you could make so many different maps of the same place
Yes.
depending on what you wanted to show about that place. And so I think I mentioned I'm working on that map or that book, Pittsburgh in 50 Maps. And it was tough to confine it to just 50.
Right.
Um, because it's far enough along in the production process that I can't change it. But I keep
Darn.
thinking of like, oh, it would have been cool to do a map of this. It would have been cool to do a map of that. And every map I made, I had to make decisions about what do I show on the map, what don't I show, what things are relevant enough to this theme that they help tell the story versus what would be a distraction or overcomplicate things or you know
Mm-hmm.
all those choices that you have to make. And I think getting students, I guess what I would say is my biggest recommendation for K-12 teachers, if you're getting students working with maps, is have them make maps, not just read maps.
Yes.
Because I think once you try to actually make that map yourself, you're forced to think about all those kinds of issues in a lot more detail and have that kind of personal experience with making choices about scale, making choices about symbology. What kinds of symbols and colors and things are you using to represent these things on your map?
Mm-hmm.
What are you including? What are you leaving off? And I think those are the most important things to understand about maps. Um, is how all those choices go into it. And so if you've had the experience of making the map yourself, so like another exercise that I've done in my world regional geography class is that when we were looking at Middle and South America, one of the themes that we were looking at was democracy and like
Mm.
how is democracy spread or receded in different countries in that area. And so I give them this like table with a whole bunch of different variables that are
Mm,
relevant to democracy. So like voter registration numbers, participation in recent elections, ratings of press freedom from certain organizations that do that, various sorts of things that might be indicators of democracy, but no one of them is like the measure of democracy, right? No, one of them is the indisputable democracy number. And I'm
yeah.
like, okay, make a map illustrating democracy in Middle and South America. Like,
Hmm.
here's a bunch of data to work with. How would you make a map that conveys which countries are more democratic and which are less democratic based on this data? And so they have to make all those choices. They have
Mm,
to, I'm not just giving them, here's numbers, put them on the map, but they have to figure out, okay, how do we represent these numbers? Do we focus on certain ones that are the most important? Do we average them together somehow? What do we do when there's no data for
ooh,
a country, right? Because
yeah.
certain country you might have data, maybe you have the voter registration numbers for Uruguay, but the data I gave you didn't have the freedom of speech rating for Uruguay. So if you're trying to use both those data points, what do you do when you only have some of them for a certain country? Um, and all of those kinds of choices. And obviously, you have to scale it to the level that your students are at. You're not going to
Right.
give a chart of democracy statistics to a second grader. But there are different ways that you can encourage students to think about what kind of choices do you have to
Yeah.
make a map out of this information, and how does that affect what we can learn from looking at that map.
Hmm. Yeah, I think in my state at least, there's a lot of talk. There are a lot of lessons on civics and what it means to participate in civics at the town level or at the community
Mm-hmm.
level. So even just walking around your neighborhood with your parent and saying, do you vote yes or no, or
Mm-hmm.
how do you show that you are a citizen of the town of Pittsburgh or the town of
Mm-hmm.
Worcester or whatever, what does citizenship mean to that person? Could be a really interesting map as well. But like you said,
Mm-hmm.
you're making choices of what's on the map based on the data points that are available. And I would imagine maybe sometimes you're given incomplete data or you're given outdated data. What happens if
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing a research project and I can only find the voter registration numbers of Uruguay from 2021 when I'm trying to make
Mm-hmm.
a map of 2024. What do I do then?
Yep.
What kinds of choices
Yep.
do I make? Oh, this could be great.
Yeah. I mean, that your idea about thinking about civic engagement, like that's another thing. You could take a walk around your town and look at the way people are displaying their civic engagement,
Right.
right? Who has election signs out or other sort of, political or issue statement signs, right? Like the everyone is welcome signs or,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and how are they showing their civic engagement? Do you see more of certain things in certain neighborhoods than others?
Mm-hmm.
What might be the reason for that? Um,
Right. Oh, I'm thinking about all the fantastic implications there too, especially when you have dystopian fiction. Like, would President
mhm,
Snow have?
right.
Would Are we gonna have? Are we gonna have our "Everyone is welcome here" kind of signs in
Uh-huh.
with President Snow's campaign? What are we?
Right.
Ooh, I
Yeah.
had a student decide she wanted to come up with I think we were reading book 4 of The Goblet of Fire, and she wanted to come up with campaign slogans for Voldemort. It was great.
Mm.
I'm like, I don't think Voldemort's going to campaign. She's
Uh-huh.
like, yeah, but
Yeah.
it's for the Death Eaters, so that's okay. He's either trying to get the Death Eaters on our side. I'm like, yeah, all
Hmm.
right, sure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she made little campaign signs for Voldemort. It was great.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've been talking a lot about the idea of making maps of the real world, right? Making
Right.
that map of your neighborhood and stuff. But I think there's also a lot of value in encouraging students to make maps of imaginary places,
Yeah.
right? Because you have to think as you're making this map, why are you making it this way? Why did you put mountains here and not there? Is that reflecting something about how mountains are created in the real world, or is it reflecting something about what makes your world different from
Mm.
the real world? Because, there's been, circling back to Tolkien, right? There's been a lot of interesting discussion about the geology of Middle Earth and to
Right.
what extent is it consistent with real world geology? Because a lot of our, understanding of geology today is rooted in the theory of plate tectonics, which only really became sort of fully worked out after Tolkien had kind of invented most of Middle Earth, right? So he couldn't go back to first principles with plate tectonics,
No.
even if he had wanted to when he was designing Middle Earth. And various people have proposed different, ways that the, continental drift and stuff could have happened in Middle Earth to create this. And, was he an intelligent enough observer of his landscape that he was able to create something that was geologically plausible, even if he didn't know the explicit, what we now know today about how things go. And then there's also the element of, well, this is a world in which magic exists.
Right.
And so he explicitly says, right, like the Silmarillion explicitly says, the Misty Mountains, like they're not the result of continental drift. They're the
Right.
result of, you know, trying to create a barrier. Uh, they were magically created.
Right.
And the same thing, the mountains around Mordor were like magically created to create a wall for Sauron. They were not
Right.
the result of plate tectonics. So both understanding what in your world is based on your understanding of the real world and what in your world is based on, the things that you're introducing that make it a different world from ours. Um, and it's, and you can't just be like, oh, well, it's magic, so I don't
Right.
have to explain it, right? Because you have to explain magic too, right?
You do. You
Like
have to
Sauron
explain
didn't
why
just
there's a
make
green sun.
mountains randomly. He
Right.
made them for a reason. And it's a different
Yes.
reason than any mountains exist in our real world, but it's still a reason.
It's
It's
still a
still something
reason.
that makes sense with the geography of the place. So I think an exercise of, uh, you know, of, of getting students to invent their own world and make a map of it and explain why they mapped it the way they did, right? Why did you
Mhm.
put things where you put them versus where else you could have put them? Why did you choose to show certain things on your map and not others, right?
Mm.
Why did you decide to mark forests on your map? Because not every map has to show where there are forests.
Right.
Why did you choose to, put this or that on the map? um, becomes an interesting question, helps them think more deeply about geography and about the other maps that they may run into in life.
That's awesome. I love it. How about this? I'm sorry, this question is not on my list, but it popped up and as we were talking. Do you know of any like technological or modes of technology that, because I know you're interested in geocaching.
Mm-hmm.
Geocaching so much fun.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, my dad.
Geocaching is a great way to explore the world around you, get to know it, and you can do it with kids. Like
Mhm.
uh, they there's a lot of kid-friendly geocaching out there if you know what you're looking for. There's actually a podcast called Geocaching with Kids
I love it.
that has a lot of ideas about, how to involve kids in geocaching process and thereby help them learn about the world around them.
Yes. So how about like technology that teachers could use, or even though we do want kids perhaps to use, be tactile with maps or
Hmm.
physically draw them out. I wonder if there are some technology, I'm sure there's some technology that a teacher could bring to the classroom to demonstrate maps. Can you think of any can you think of any while I have you?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of kinds of technology that you can take advantage of. So uh, the simplest thing is just you can edit a Google map.
Yeah.
You can make your own Google map, put your own place markers and routes and
Oh,
stuff on it. And that can be a really simple way. If you're trying to map out things about a real world place, that's the limitation is that it has to be a real place
yeah.
to be on Google Maps. But
Darn it.
you could use that as a sort of a base for, you're reading a book that's about people doing stuff in the real world. You can go mark those places on a custom Google map and then add stuff to it. Because then when you click on the place marker, a little balloon pops up. You can add photos or drawings. You can add text that you've written about that place. So you can make a Google map that shows the story of this book you've just read in a map format rather than the book format, and enhance
Mm-hmm.
it with all kinds of different things. You can do the same thing if you're walking around your own neighborhood. right? So to make your map of where the trees are different colors, right, you could put pins on a Google map as your way of actually representing that. And then that makes it easy to share with other people too. You can just send them the
Mm.
link to it. And then if you want to get more sophisticated, you can get an account through Esri, the company that makes ArcGIS, which is sort of the biggest GIS program, the most popular one out there. And so they have an online version that you can use that, and if you are an educator, you can get like a discount and get access to features and stuff, and then create accounts for your students. And then you can do all those same kinds of things there, but then you can also import data files. So
Mm.
you can import like census data into it and easily display that alongside, so you could go around, like walk around your neighborhood and record, who has signs out for which political candidate, and then pull in some census data and see, is there a correspondence there based on the income or the race or whatever other features about the people there, or not. Sometimes
Hmm.
there's not. Sometimes that's the interesting thing, is the two things you'd think would go together don't.
Yes.
um,
And that's an important data point.
yeah, exactly. So that, if you have access to that, that allows you to pull in a lot of this other geographical data that other people have made, and play around a lot with how it's displayed. Change the color schemes, change the symbology, uh, all those kinds of things. And then also GPS technology for recording things. So if you are out in the field gathering your data, instead of just like writing it down on a paper map, or noting the address of something, you could actually drop a pin with a GPS app and then import that into Google Maps or Arc, and then put that up there.
That's great.
So yeah, there's a lot of great ways that technology can uh, help you engage with these geographical ideas.
Yeah. And I think ultimately what I would hope for as a if I were teaching history, social studies, would be I want to use technology, but I don't want technology to do the thinking for me in terms of that
Exactly.
mapping. I
Exactly.
still want
Yes.
my students to think about that census data
Mm-hmm.
or think about those points, those pins in the map, so that
Mm-hmm.
I'm still creating it. And the technology is just helping me show what I'm discovering.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's very helpful. Yeah, because I like Google Maps and I have no sense of
Mm-hmm.
direction whatsoever when I'm driving, but I still want to be able to interact with a fantasy map. I'm going to work
Mm-hmm.
on my maps. I'm going to probably maybe I'll get into geocaching with my dad again. That's what he used to do with us when we
Okay.
on the weekends, and
Okay.
maybe I'll do that again to reteach myself some mapping skills because I have
Mm-hmm.
none. But yes. Thank you so much, Stentor, for
uh,
joining me today. Before we say goodbye, do you want to share some more about the publications that are coming up for you? Do you have any other upcoming projects you'd like to share, or anything that you want our audience to keep an eye out for?
sure. So first, thank you so much for having me on. It was so much fun to talk about all of this stuff, and I hope people that are listening get something out of it, get some cool ideas. I'd love to hear what people come up with. If people get inspired from this and come up with a cool lesson plan, I'd love to hear about it. Because I love maps and I love everything people do with maps. So in terms of other projects and stuff to tell people about, I've mentioned I'm working on that book, Pittsburgh in 50 Maps. I'm not sure if I'm officially allowed to tell people a publication date on it quite yet, but keep an eye out for it. And if you're not in Pittsburgh, they have already, as I said, Buffalo in 50 Maps, Cleveland in 50 Maps, and Detroit in 50 Maps. So if you're familiar with any of those cities and want to check those out, you can look those up, and it's really cool just to see all the different things you can see about the same place by mapping it differently. And then I've got some other publications in the works, but I don't know exactly when any of them are coming out, or even in some cases the venue that they're going to get published in. But people can find me on social media. I'll post about it when that happens. So my personal social media, uh, the best place you'd follow is on Twitter or Blue Sky. I'm Chef Stentor, which is a joke from the old days about how people just post about their lunch on Twitter. So those publications I'll post on those platforms. And then I also have my Etsy store there where I make and sell maps. And so people that are watching the video version of this have seen my fantasy map of Brooklyn behind at least there this whole time. So I have maps of lots of different places, and you commission me to do ones that I haven't done yet. So that is Mapsburg with an H on it, like Pittsburgh. And so that's on Etsy. You can also find me on various social media under that name, or just go to mapsburg.com. And it'll send you to all the places that you can look at that.
Brilliant. And I'll also have those links available in the show notes too, for sure. And as you mentioned, the 50 States books, I'm suddenly thinking of Boston and having a map of Boston, because I'm from Massachusetts, so yay Boston. Of all of the places you can get a lobster claw or a lobster tail pastry. Got to have a lobster tail pastry if you're coming to Boston. So how many places can you get a decent lobster tail? Oh goodness, that would be a great map.
That'd be a great one to do, yeah.
Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.